Hey, Jason,
Yes, Gary.
have you been outside lately?
I have been outside as recently as about 12 minutes ago.
Oh, man.
If it had been a day like today was about 3 weeks ago,
Yeah.
we would have thought it was terribly cold outside.
But today,
But after what we've been through,
well, it's
today
only
felt really good.
it's only like 40 degrees warmer than it was when it started out yesterday.
Yeah. And that was an important 40 degrees.
That was an important 40 degrees.
Hey, Gary.
Hey, Jason.
So what are we studying Sunday since our schedule got all monkeyed around?
That's a good question. We are going to leave everything the way it was going to be, and so this was a week for everybody either to get caught up or ahead or whatever, and so we're going to be Job on Sunday.
So we're Jobing on Sunday.
We're Jobing
Okay.
on Sunday.
Well, what if I already started reading Joshua?
That's a good idea. That was a very good plan to get ahead a little bit on Joshua, and that way
Okay.
you can kind of take it
Is
easy
that
on
okay?
Joshua.
Can I listen to a lesson on Job after I read Joshua?
Yeah, if you want, because we're already thinking in our heads clear down to Judges. So yeah, it's okay if people just got caught up on their reading. Maybe they were behind, they got caught up, or they were caught up and they got ahead. It's all good.
Would it be okay to read Joshua again next week?
That would be so excellent to read Joshua through twice.
Okay.
That would be very, very good.
I'm worried I'm going to get confuser than I already am.
I think we're both confuser than we already are.
Okay.
Sunday, Amy taught class last Wednesday night, so she didn't get to see our awesome lesson, and so we watched that Sunday morning.
Oh.
That was a good thing to do on Sunday morning, to watch that together. And I was thinking about, we were talking about 7 times.
Yes.
And whether that was a year or what that was, and I got to wondering if it was just times, if the importance is in the 7 and not in the length of time.
Well, I wondered that because the 7 represents, it was all the time he needed.
Exactly. However
Yeah.
long he needed to come to his senses. And I don't know if he terminated it, God determined how long that was going to be, or he did. But I got to thinking it probably, the importance is in the 7, not in, if it's really a year or month or whatever.
Is that going to be an important thought for later in the book of Daniel?
Probably.
The idea of 7 being a complete amount of time?
I bet it will.
Okay.
And then the other thing, as we were watching that, Amy got to calculating,
Oh, no.
and a liar is a zither.
I'm glad you showed a picture because that wouldn't have done me any good.
I would have been a whole lot better being told that a zither was a liar,
Okay.
because I know what a liar is. I don't have a clue what a zither is. It's kind of like a dulcimer. You know what a dulcimer is?
I know they use hammers on it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
up in the mountains and some of those backwoods. What's that? This one? Well, I don't know. I think they had different ways of playing these with their fingers. They didn't necessarily use hammers, but
My grade school music teacher, Mrs. Domosic, played an auto harp that looked kind of like that.
yeah, an auto harp is just a little bit more complicated.
Yeah,
But yeah, an
it
auto
had
harp would be
buttons.
kind of like that.
Yeah.
So now you know that a lyre is a zither when you read that list of instruments that were played for everybody to bow down. And a trigon
Oh boy.
is a trigon. We said it was 3 of something, and it's a triangular musical instrument, stringed instrument.
Okay.
And so,
It looks like is that ZZ Top?
yeah,
Is that,
it is.
they got the beards and the guitars. Okay.
Yeah. And psaltery, I forgot I need to use this to advance, not that
Okay.
thing. A psaltery is a triangular harp.
Okay.
So a trigon's a triangular harp thing, and a psaltery is a triangular harp thing, and they're just all different triangular harp
I
things.
get the feeling just anything that they could put strings on and pluck them on, they just put some strings on it and started plucking.
That's it. And so they had all sorts of, had a whole orchestra of 3-sided instruments.
Three-sided stringed instruments.
That's
Okay.
exactly right. So if we have any time left, what are we going to talk about tonight?
Well, hey, we're going to talk about some ferocious felines.
Awesome. We're going to do Daniel and the
Yes.
lions. I've got a song for that.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And the first verse goes, Daniel, 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 Daniel. And
Yeah.
you know that one. The second verse is, who did swallow Daniel? Who did swallow Daniel up?
No, nobody.
And the third verse is, lions did. Is that how it goes?
It wasn't Daniel they swallowed up.
I hope you have a better ending for that story then when we get there, because that's how my song ends, with the lion swallowing Daniel. I don't like that ending.
I don't know where that ending came from.
that's what lions do. I mean,
Well,
if you put someone in with a bunch of hungry lions,
not if they're named Daniel.
oh, okay, it's all in the name.
Yeah.
And I hope you do a better job of telling that story than I did.
I'll give it a go.
So I'll start with 5. That'll leave you 6.
Okay.
And chapter 5 begins with a party. And it is the party thrown by Belshazzar.
Were there trigons and psalteries there?
There were trigons, psalteries, all of those things.
Zithers.
Zithers and flutes and you name it, and it was there. And so it was a big party. Belshazzar, although in the text he's listed as the son of Nebuchadnezzar, it means descendant. Nebuchadnezzar is his forefather, his grandfather. And probably historically, Belshazzar was in charge of that immediate district around the capital city, and his father was off over a larger area of the whole kingdom, but he'd been put in charge of that. And so Belshazzar the king held a feast, a great feast, for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, in order that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God which was in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Belshazzar throws a feast for 1,000 of his officials.
Closest friends.
His closest friends. 1,000 of his closest friends came to this party. And it got to the point where they brought in the gold and silver vessels that had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem. They used those vessels to drink and praise the gods of silver and bronze and iron and gold and stone, all of their gods of those various minerals and building materials, construction materials, and used vessels that had been dedicated to Jehovah to drink praises to their various heathen idols. Have you ever heard someone say he saw the handwriting on the wall?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what happened with Belshazzar. He saw the handwriting on the wall because suddenly the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. That's Rembrandt's version of what he saw, so about as good as any. That he saw the back of a hand, and the hand was writing on the wall, was writing these words. And so he sees the fingers of a man's hand, the back of his hand, and I love the description of Belshazzar.
Mm-hmm.
His face grew pale. That's maybe an understatement. His thoughts alarmed him, and then his hip joints went slack and his knees began knocking together. I wonder if he was just a little bit scared. You know, when you turn pale white and your hip joints go out of place and your knees start knocking together, I think that's a sign that you are scared to death. And so what does he do? He cries for help. He sends out a plea for help. What would you do in that situation other than faint? And so the king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, "Any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me will be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, his face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. And so he got scareder than he was before. He calls in that same group of people, you know, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, the diviners, the ones that Nebuchadnezzar called in whenever he had a problem. And then he said, anybody who can read this and explain it, he's going to get the royal treatment. He's going to be clothed in purple, a necklace of gold, and I'm going to make him the third ruler in the kingdom. And that's because he was the second ruler in the kingdom, and he didn't want to give that away. And so he could give someone authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. And so he was scared by what he saw, and then it just got worse. He calls in all those people to help him out. They haven't been able to help out Nebuchadnezzar, but that's what he does, is he calls them in. But then in verses 10 through 12, he receives some information that there is somebody who can do this. And the queen entered the banquet hall, and it's probably his grandmother or mother. Sounds like his grandmother, maybe, the Nebuchadnezzar's widow. The queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. The queen spoke and said, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods." And here again, we've wondered whether they really got it or not. And she doesn't identify him as the spirit of the holy God, but of the holy gods. "And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because of an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar." And she recommended to let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. And so she spoke up and said there is somebody who can do that, and he has the spirit of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar appointed him the chief of all these people because he has extraordinary spirit and knowledge and insight. He knows how to interpret dreams, he knows how to explain enigmas, and he knows how to solve difficult problems. My question is, why didn't he already know about Daniel's existence? It couldn't have been a secret what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. As you pointed out last time, it was written in the form of something that was going to be recorded in the official archives. That Nebuchadnezzar dictated this to be kept in their official records and publicized and sent around. It wasn't just something he wrote down in his diary. How could his grandson not know that story? And how could he not know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? How could he not know these things? That his grandmother or mother had to say, there is somebody who can take care of this. Nebuchadnezzar figured out who he was, and he has the ability to do this. And so in verses 13 through 16, he does call in Daniel. And he says, "Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, 'Are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now I have heard about you that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you.'" He heard about him just about 5 minutes ago when his mother or grandmother told him about it. "So I've heard about you. Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me. But they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom." He asks him, "Are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles?" Daniel has been in charge of the kingdom. And he just knows him as one of those exiles that Nebuchadnezzar brought in. I have heard, as I said, he just heard just a few minutes ago. It's something the wise men and the conjurers can't do, but I personally have heard of you. If you are able to do this, then I will give you the reward. And so he turns to Daniel and asks Daniel to help solve this challenge. Basically, Daniel's reply is, don't bother. You can keep your gifts for yourself. And then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Keep your gifts for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. O king, the most high God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, your father. And because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished he killed, and whomever he wished he spared alive. And whomever he wished, he elevated, and whomever he wished, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets it over whomever he wishes. Daniel says, keep your gifts for yourselves. I don't want them. No. And we mentioned before, Daniel doesn't respond the way most of us would respond. He had an opportunity early on to eliminate all those fake wise men. Mm-hmm. But instead, he answered what the king was requesting and saved all of them. And they turned right around and thanked him by trying to set up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to get burned in the fiery furnace. And so most humans, if they were offered third position in the most powerful nation in the world, would probably say okay, and especially if it went along with lots of riches. But he says just keep them for yourselves. And it's probably because he just really didn't care about it. But it may have something to do with the rest of the interpretation of the writing on the handwriting on the wall, because those gifts may not have been worth just a whole lot.
They didn't have staying power.
They had no staying power. We'll see that in just a second. And he said, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to your grandfather, to your father Nebuchadnezzar. God is the one who gave him everything he had. And so basically what he may be saying is, if you think you're going to give me something, you need to understand who's the giver here. And it's God who gives things, and you don't. But even Nebuchadnezzar, when his heart was lifted up, his glory was taken away. And it was taken away until he recognized who God was, that God is the Most High God, and he is the ruler. And he lived like an animal and ate grass until he recognized that. Probably not the answer that Belshazzar was looking for, not the kind of response that he expected from anybody, any living human, but that's what Daniel gave him. He goes on. Daniel doesn't stop there, but he goes on in verses 22 and 23 and say, yet you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. So that indicates that he should have known what happened to his grandfather. Because he says, even though you knew all of this, he just didn't care, I guess. That didn't make any difference to him. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you. And you and your nobles and your wives and your concubines have been drinking wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand. But the God in whose hand are your life breath and your ways, you have not glorified. In spite of the fact that you knew all this, you have not humbled your heart. Can you imagine knowing the story of your grandfather who was turned into an animal and crawled around on all fours and had nails like claws and hair like feathers and ate grass? You didn't pay any attention to that story. You haven't humbled your heart, but instead you've exalted yourself against God, because you take these vessels that were dedicated to him in his temple and you use them to praise these other gods. You need to understand that he's the God that holds your life in his hands, that your life breath and your ways are in his hands, and you still haven't glorified him. Of course, we have to wonder if we don't do the same thing today sometimes, that we exalt ourselves, we set ourselves up, we just stop realizing that God holds our lives and our ways in his hands, but we don't glorify him. Yeah, I think we do get, I think you're right. I do think sometimes we get to the point where we're exempt, somehow we get a buy. And we need to be reminded that we need to glorify God in everything we do. Just because he's all there is. There is nothing other than God. But you can see the list of things that Belshazzar is doing wrong.
You know, Daniel didn't shy away from telling him exactly how it was. You know, he didn't pull any punches.
And that's a good point too, that he did not pull any punches. Again, we're talking about one of the most powerful men in the world. And we've mentioned that when Esther was asked to go into the king, she could not go into the king unless she was invited, or she would have been killed right then. And for Daniel to speak up this way was a brave thing. To say to the ruler, you're just wrong. You just don't get it, and you're doing everything wrong. And so you're right, Chuck, that it was a brave thing for him to do, but he was willing to stand up and do what he was supposed to do and do what was right.
I think that the tone he takes here with Belshazzar also suggests, I mean, consider the way that he delivered bad news to Nebuchadnezzar, where he did not relish that job, and he didn't want to give Nebuchadnezzar that bad news. So even though Nebuchadnezzar was a pagan and was, you know, not a God-fearer the way we would want him to be, he still maybe was a decent man.
Yeah.
But you know, by worldly standards or something. But Belshazzar here does not get Daniel's respect.
I think that's exactly right. There's a big contrast. You know, Daniel, when he was telling Nebuchadnezzar that he was going to be turned into an animal, he said, "I just wish this applied to your enemies and not to you." And that just shows the kind of affection that he had for Nebuchadnezzar, the respect. And Nebuchadnezzar had done something to deserve that. Mm-hmm. And Belshazzar has done something to deserve the opposite. And it does reflect in how he answers. Daniel begins then to interpret the dream, and he says, "Then the hand was sent from him," God. "This inscription was written out." Now this is the inscription that was written out, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. It's not quite like a doctor's handwriting. You could see the handwriting, you just had to have somebody that interpreted it. And so his handwriting was clear, you just had to have an interpreter. So those of you who read Aramaic, that first one is what's translated Mene, which has to do with the mina, which was 60 gold shekels, but it was a counting thing. You have been numbered, you have been counted, and an end has been put to it. The second word was tekel, that has to do with weighing. And so what he says is you've been numbered and you've been weighed. You've been numbered, and you've been weighed. And then Upharsin means that your king is a word for division, a half of a mina. And so your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And so you've been numbered, you've been weighed, and you came up short, is what he's saying. The Mene is numbered and put to an end, Tekel, weighed and found deficient, Upharsin, kingdom divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And then he goes on to explain what all of this means. Then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Daniel didn't want it. He gave it to him anyway. That same night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. So, as you say, that did not have much lasting power. The handwriting was on the wall, but it was carried out right then, that same night. And it passed on to Darius the Mede at about age 62. And so the king rewarded Daniel anyway, although Daniel knew that wasn't worth much. And apparently the king didn't pay much attention either, because Daniel just told him, your kingdom is over. And that same night is when it was carried out, and Darius received the kingdom. Now, you would expect all of the rulers of a conquered kingdom to be killed. I mean, that would be the natural thing, I would think, to wipe out the leaders of a kingdom that you've just conquered.
Which maybe was why Daniel didn't want to be third in charge.
Maybe he didn't want to be third in charge, because that would set him up. Well, I think what we're going to see in your chapter indicates some more about the character of Daniel and about God's providence.
So, another question about Belshazzar. Why does Belshazzar see the handwriting on the wall and automatically he's afraid and he assumes something bad? Why does he not think, I bet that hand's telling me my kingdom's going to last forever.
Well, he may have had a little bit of an inkling of how his kingdom was going, but if a hand appeared on that wall right now and started writing, my knees would probably knock too, because that would be kind of scary.
It would be. But I think, I don't know if we can draw too much about it, but it just seems to me that maybe, why do men love the dark?
Mm-hmm.
Because their deeds are evil.
Yeah.
And I think, there are times like this, why did Adam and Eve hear God walking in the garden and hide?
Yeah.
Because they knew what they'd done. Why does Belshazzar see the handwriting on the wall and know this can't be good for me?
Yeah.
Because even though it's the way he's living, even though it's the choices he's making, he's in charge of everything in his own mind. He knows that his character is deficient.
Unless he was just totally lost, he had to have known where those vessels came from, and the lessons his grandfather had learned about Jehovah God.
Mm-hmm.
And to go ahead and treat them the way he did is just total disregard.
Yeah. So it's just, I guess it's something that makes me think about, when we, like as we're reading through the Bible and we see, something that convicts us, we probably knew before we read that passage that just convicted us that, we needed to make some changes or whatever, but now we have that opportunity. And, God has a way of putting those things before us to remind us of what we need to do.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Right.
This, Darius took over, does that mean that Medes were already part of the kingdom, or did they get on? Do we have any information on that?
So what happen?
Well, how did he take over? I mean,
He was the king of the army that moved in that night and took over Babylon. The story.
So there was he wasn't part of the kingdom already.
No, he was the opposing force. Interestingly, back when Nebuchadnezzar took power from the Assyrians, the Medes were involved in some of that. And so the Medes have been a powerful force all along, and for some reason they weren't involved in the Babylonian Empire, but they have they've been built up to the point where they're ready to take over the Babylonians. The story is that the river ran under the wall around Babylon, and they had ways to like grading or something down there. But the story is that the Medes and the Persians dammed up the river upstream, and that way they just walked into Babylon and just marched in that night. Well, what's the king doing? He and 1,000 of his closest friends are drunk.
He and all of his military officials are not paying very close attention. And it was not, we often think about the way kingdom transitions took place often back then. There were, long sieges and battles and lots of death and destruction. This one seems to have been a relatively peaceful transition, other than for Belshazzar.
Yeah, for Belshazzar, it wasn't real peaceful,
but you had to get rid of the king. But then once, there's basically a, hey, we're here and we're taking over, and everybody said okay.
Yeah, so it was a non-battle, but it was a military defeat, but in a non-battle way.
Yeah. So, well,
that sets you up
we're
for.
finally here, Gary.
I cannot wait to see
I hope it lives up to your expectations.
I hope the story ends better than I had it figured out.
Okay. Daniel chapter 6. We'll start with verses 1 through 5. It seemed good to, is it Darius?
It's potatoes and potatoes.
Okay. Seemed good to Darius.
However you're
Darius.
comfortable.
I'm going to end up saying Darius anyway,
That's
so
fine.
I might as well just start out that way. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, so that they should be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, one of whom was Daniel, that these satraps might be accountable to them and the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. So Darius comes in and he's taking over a new territory, a new kingdom, a new kingdom, and he's got to appoint some people to kind of rule over that for him. And we see this even if you think back to what Nebuchadnezzar did at when he came in the first time and took over Jerusalem. He took out the king that was there and put in a king that was supposedly going to do what he wanted him to do. Didn't do a very good job of it, so he had to put a new one in later. But we see this kind of thing happen often, where the conquering king will come in and put leadership in that will be malleable to their desires. So Daniel is one of the 3 overseers over that region, over that area, over the 120 that are established. We might think of governors and mayors as kind of a hierarchy, people that are over individual cities, and then more of a governor that's over a region that's bigger than that. And Daniel establishes himself over the others. His area of rule does well, and the king doesn't suffer any loss. He collects the taxes he's supposed to collect. There's no trouble. There's no disruption. There's no difficulties there because Daniel is a good leader. The others presumably were having trouble, or were having corruption, or were having not as much success as Daniel, at least. And in their jealousy, they plot against Daniel, but they find no grounds to accuse him, which again begs the question, why would they assume there is going to be some grounds to accuse Daniel?
Because there are grounds to accuse them.
Because they probably know if we dug too far into their doings that there was going to be something going on that they shouldn't be doing.
How old do you think Daniel is by this time?
Daniel is probably at least 80 years old, if not mid-80s by now. He would have been 15 to 17 at the beginning of the book of Daniel, and which was 605 when he was taken into captivity. And this is taking place in about 538. So about 68 years later, 67 years later that this is taking place. So if he was early teens, then he'd be right at 80. If he was mid or late teens, then he's mid to early to mid 80s.
So we get to see a long life, a very faithful life.
Mm-hmm. Daniel is, search the Bible and see if you can find a negative statement about Daniel. I mean, we can read negative stories about all of the major characters. We can read something that they did that was not pleasing to God, but search and see if you can find something bad said about Daniel. It's not there. So not to say that he was perfect or never did anything bad. We just don't have it recorded. So he was, by any standard, very, very faithful. So they're jealous. They plot to try to accuse Daniel. They start digging into his tax records. The New York Times releases some stories. A congressional commission is launched, and there's no grounds for impeachment. Okay, therefore, charges will have to be manufactured. I took that a little too far, probably, but I'm just trying to put it in our common vernacular so we'd understand it. Therefore, charges will have to be manufactured. We can't find any way to charge him, so we're going to have to come up with something. We're going to have to manufacture some charges. Verses 6 through 9 says, Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom lie. Sorry, that was commentary. That's not in the text. But all the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document that is the injunction. A proposition is laid out for the king, and they come to the king and they say, O king, we have all agreed. This is by unanimous consent of your board of governors that we would like to institute this rule or this law. But it wasn't by unanimous consent. Because
one of the 3 highest ones didn't vote yes.
The one that the king has placed the most faith and trust in is not present and has not agreed to this. And so, they're lying from the very beginning. They are very disingenuous. They're playing to the king's pride, to his arrogance. They've also got, there's some possible very practical or pragmatic reasons that the king would want to do this that we'll talk about. But the men used the structure of Persian law to their advantage. They knew the rules. They knew that the Persian law was such that a king could not reverse his decision on these things. It was to keep a king from being wishy-washy about things. It was to keep him from showing favoritism. It was to keep him, it was to make him think things through before he passed a law, because if he passed a law that, ended up hurting things and then he couldn't go back and revoke that law, then it, perhaps would slow him down in making some kind of a rash judgment or rash law. And so they get this in there to their advantage. Verses 10 to 15. Now, when Daniel knew the document was signed, he entered his house. Now, in his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? King answered and said, the statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. So Daniel knows the decree, but he continues to pray as he always has. And it's interesting, the text goes to the length to tell us that Daniel continues his daily routine. This is not a law that Daniel has heard about and then thought, well, that's not a good law, and so I should do something to show that I'm protesting the law, and so I'm going to start praying 3 times a day to God. Daniel is already in the habit of doing that. And it kind of, the only reason I say that is because I think about the direction that it seems that our society is heading. And if we're not already living the way that we're supposed to be living, waiting until society gets to the point that we feel like we then have to do something in our lives to show that we're rebelling against that society or that we're going to take a stand against that society is probably not a plan that's going to be real effective or fruitful. We need to be living that way now, like Daniel was. Daniel was living in such a way so that they knew they could count on him. Daniel, we can count on you to continue this and break the law that we're about to pass, and that's going to be how we can accuse you. I hope that we're that kind of people. I hope that we're living in such a way that if laws are passed that are contrary to God's will, that they'll be passed by people that know we're going to continue to break them, or that we're going to break those laws and continue to do what we've always done. So, I mean, we need to be like Daniel. The men approach the king and they remind him of the decree. Again, the king, the king at the end of the story knows he's been played and he takes appropriate response to that. But here, through this part of the story, they are playing the king like a fiddle because they have him set up. They have him painted into a corner, and they're going to remind him that he's painted into a corner every step along the way here. So they approach the king and they remind him of the decree, and the king says, yes, I remember that decree, and yes, I remember that the law can't be revoked.
They're playing him like a zither.
A zither. There were no fiddles. There were zithers. Yeah, a psaltery. Then they named Daniel as a violator of the law, and you can almost see the king's jaw drop. You can see the realization on his face of, I've been played here. I've been zithered. And this is
Yeah,
there you go.
That's right.
They were playing the liar.
He's been liar.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
All right, that was worth the price of admission right there. Okay. So the king is distressed by the news, and I think so. Remember, this is not a great length of time has passed between the end of Daniel chapter 5 and Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6 is about the consolidation of power of the new kingdom. And why did the king allow this law to be made? Well, it makes sense for a new king who's coming in, especially in their culture in their day and age, to come in and to remind the people that he's just conquered that he is in control, that he's the one that has the power, and that they should not do things to rebel against that power, that they should not do things that would question his authority. And so it wasn't just an arrogance, a play on the king's pride here to get him to do this, as sometimes it's portrayed. I think there was a pragmatic side to this where the king is thinking, this makes sense from a cultural standpoint to let the people know that I'm in charge. This is a pragmatic ruling. So I think that's part of the reason why he's caught so off guard by the way this goes, because he doesn't question Daniel's loyalty. Do you think the king doesn't know that Daniel prays? I can't imagine that the king would not have investigated who his top officials are and wouldn't know that Daniel is an exile from Judah, that Daniel is known as a man of God, that Daniel follows the one true God. All these things the king would have known about Daniel. And yet now the king realizes this wasn't about finding people who are disloyal to me, because I never questioned Daniel's loyalty. But it's about removing somebody that they see as a threat. And so I think the king is seeing here how the law has been used against him. That's why he goes to such great lengths to try to undo what he has done. It says he works until evening. He puts it off as long as he can. He doesn't want to pass this judgment against Daniel. And so the king spends the rest of the day trying to save Daniel from the very law that he has agreed to. But then the men, and again, it says, that by agreement they come into the king. This isn't one guy coming in and saying, King, you need to do this. This is all of them coming in together, showing a united front and saying, King, all of your governors are here watching you to see if you're going to be a man who upholds the law or not. All of your governors are in here to remind you that you said you would do this. And it's not one of us against you, it's all of us standing in unison against you right here. So I think they're showing the king, they think, who is in charge, and they're showing the king, some what they think is backbone and some seriousness here. But the king's going to show them something here in a minute. So verses 16 through 18, the king gave orders. His hands are tied. I mean, he's got to do it. So Daniel was brought in, and he was cast into the lion's den. And the king spoke to Daniel and said, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing might be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. So Daniel's cast into the lion's den. They go to great lengths to ensure that it's done according to the law. They roll the stone in front of it. They seal it with their rings so that there can be no foul play. But the king has already declared, your God is going to save you.
Which answers what you were saying before, that he knew Daniel. He knew that he prayed 3 times a day. He knew the God that he worshiped. He knew all that because he had the confidence to say that the God whom you serve will save you.
Exactly. And so the king is placing confidence in Daniel. And while King Darius may not know Daniel's God the way that we would hope that he would, but the king knows Daniel. And the faith that Daniel has placed in God, the king believes will be rewarded. And so the king, in his confidence, does everything above board. At this point, he's got to show that he has not done anything to try to rescue Daniel, that he's not done anything to undermine his own authority as king by not fulfilling completely the rule that he has passed. And he's going to make sure that when Daniel is delivered, he's not delivered because of Darius, he's delivered because of God.
I noticed the big difference between Nebuchadnezzar and Meshach and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar was furious.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
They said, our God can deliver us, and even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow
Right.
down to you. And yet, in Darius's position, he was heartbroken that he had to do
Right.
this, and he was the one that said, your God will deliver you.
That's a good contrast, a good juxtaposition there about how the kings react, and the difference between Nebuchadnezzar being infuriated by the fact that they wouldn't bow down versus Darius being infuriated that he has to follow his own rule, and disappointed in the way things are going. So I like it. That's a good contrast. Verses 19 to 24. So Daniel gets eaten by the lions. Is
Yep.
that what you said?
Who did swallow Daniel?
Not the fish did. That,
That's another
Okay,
another
that's a
song
different
about,
verse.
about fish did.
Okay. Well, the king then arose at the dawn and at the break of day and went in haste to the lion's den. And when he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, Servant of the living God, has your God whom you constantly serve been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths.
They didn't swallow him
No
up?
feast for the lions there,
They
sir.
they just weren't hungry.
That's it. They kept them hungry for this very occasion.
Hmm.
My God has sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you, O king. I have committed no crime. Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. So the king checks on Daniel at dawn. And, you know, again, we're talking about the king of an empire here that is... Did the king not have servants that could go check on the lion's den for him?
I'm sure he could have sent somebody to find out.
The king could have said, you know, butler, go check on Daniel and see if he made it through the night. But this tells us something about the king and about how much he values Daniel and about how troubled he was over what had taken place. Even if the lions eat Daniel, do you think the satraps and governors at this point are feeling very secure about their position? Because they did this to try to secure their position above Daniel, right? And yet the next morning they see the king, they've seen the king trying to forestall this. They've seen the king not wanting to do this. They've seen the king try to put it off. Now they see the king running to check and see if Daniel is still alive. Even if Daniel's dead, the king's not going to be happy with these guys. So these guys have kind of dug their own grave, so to speak.
If they kill Daniel, it's not going to go well for them, because the king obviously likes him. And again, there's that contrast between Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego saying, even if he doesn't save us, he still is who he is.
Right.
And the same thing is true here, that God is God, whether or not Daniel survives. But the king is confident, I think, that Daniel did survive.
I think we see a little, you know, as the king is running, you know, he is great. He's concerned, and he's asking the question, Daniel, was your God able to save you? I think there's, you know, if there's, it reminds me of the man that Jesus, that came to Jesus for the healing of his son, and Jesus said, if you believe, then he shall be healed. And what did the man say?
Lord, help my unbelief.
I do believe, help my unbelief. I think the king believed. But there's also that little shred of doubt there. There's a little shred of questioning or wondering, did he save Daniel? So, you know, he calls out, Daniel, was your God able to save you? And Daniel is vindicated because he is saved. Why did it say that Daniel was saved, that not a mark was on him, inasmuch as he had trusted in his God? Because he trusted God, God saved him. And so Daniel is vindicated. He is innocent before God. He's innocent before the king. He had been the man that God had called him to be. And the king is pleased. The king is happy that Daniel is saved. That's always a good thing. When you're alive and the king's happy that you're alive, that means you're in a good place. So the enemies of the king take Daniel's place in the lion's den. And you know, I don't know if it's a morbid thought or not, but I always wondered, you know, the king didn't just throw the men in. He threw in their families. Think he threw in the families first, or just all in at once?
Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't
say.
We read about kings who kill the families.
Nebuchadnezzar did that with,
and then put out his eyes. So that was the last thing he saw.
The last thing they saw was their family being thrown into the lion's den.
Yeah.
And knowing as that's happening, it's because of what we did. I'm the one that killed my family. It's not the king. It's because of my own actions that they're suffering this horrible end. And then as soon as, you know, they watch that take place, then they're thrown in as well. It's a horrible thought. It's a horrible way to go, but it's exactly what they tried to do to Daniel. I mean, it's justified. It's
justice.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, you know, as we read through the old law, if you try maliciously or by fraud to inflict some kind of punishment upon somebody, and it's found out that you're doing it maliciously or by fraud, then the law said that you are to suffer the the faith that you were trying to bring upon somebody who was innocent. So Daniel was innocent, and the fact that they suffered what they tried to inflict upon Daniel is justice. And it is hard to read, and it's hard to picture, but it's what they deserve.
That's what people will oftentimes say, how could God let that happen to kids? You know, they use that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, we are certainly like to have a sensibilities and an understanding of nature that's over and above what God understands about nature sometimes, and what His sensibilities are. So our modern interpretation of these things sometimes gets us into trouble.
And I think it does have to do with the fact that they were responsible for the death of their families, that God was not.
Yeah.
That they tried to pass a law to make it where you couldn't worship anybody but a human, and they tried to carry that against David by making it illegal to worship the only being worthy of worship.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty big offense, to say that you have to worship this human but you can't worship God.
Right.
And so that was a big offense.
And again, I think we're reminded page after page of what we've been reading through the law and through the chapters that we've been reading recently in Daniel and Ezekiel, constantly reminded of the seriousness of sin. We downplay how serious sin is. We sugarcoat it. We whitewash it. We try to justify it. But God reminds us on every page of the Bible how serious sin is, and when we don't take heed to that, then we're setting ourselves up for terrible, terrible things. All right, so the story ends. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who are living in all the land, "May your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and enduring forever. And his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian." So the king's proclamation here, and interesting, remember, what is it about the proclamations or the laws of the Medes and Persians?
It can't be undone.
They can't be undone. So now we went from a law saying you can only bow down and worship the king to now the king sends out a proclamation to the entire kingdom saying, oh, by the way, I want you to bow down and worship Daniel's God, because Daniel's God has demonstrated that he is sovereign. So, boy, that backfired.
And it didn't do what they wanted it to do.
So now we have a king proclaiming to his entire kingdom that God is in control, which is a pretty cool end to the story. Daniel's actions ultimately are what bring glory to God. It's because Daniel was faithful that at the end of the book, the king sends out a law to everybody in the land saying, worship God. So can one man make a difference?
I think so.
Can the deeds of one person have an effect that go throughout the entire land? This is a tremendous thing here that Daniel has done, not just because it makes an awesome Bible story, not because just, we have awesome flannel graph stuff that when we were kids that was a good story to hear. It's because it tells us how important it is to be faithful. Daniel is rewarded because of his faithfulness. He sees success during the reign of Darius and also into the reign of the next king, Cyrus, the king of the Persians. And that's where we're going to get into next. And remember, Daniel is now in his 80s. Daniel has not, retired from serving God or kings, and he is not, sitting at home on Social Security. He is still faithfully serving God in his daily activities.
Do we have any questions?
Always we have questions. I've noticed, even though sometimes I forget to send you questions, you still come up with
I just
something.
make up some questions. They don't necessarily have to do with anything we're talking about, but I just got out a little
You're not
question.
going to start asking me questions about zithers and liars.
Yeah,
and stuff. Okay.
that's about zithers and liars and trigons and all those things. And Mike, if Chuck gets up, just start having a conversation with him and see if it lasts for a little while so we have time to finish.
Intercept him.
Yeah.
Keep him away from the bell.
Yeah, don't let him get to the bell. What mistakes does Belshazzar make?
Varied and many.
Which one? I think his pride motivated that whole party to start with, to invite 1,000 of your closest friends and get drunk.
You know, I mean, what you're saying about, about how the kingdom was taken over, I mean, he obviously didn't care anything about anything except about himself, I mean, because, what all happened, what ruler would do that?
Yeah.
What ruler would just, I mean, he had to, you would think that he would have had to have some knowledge of what might be impending, but he obviously didn't care.
I think that's the key. He didn't care. How many times have we seen in business that someone will build a really successful business, they'll pass on to their children and grandchildren, by the time it gets to their grandchildren, it just falls apart. Because they didn't put the effort in to build it. They just kind of cruised in along on the benefits. And Belshazzar, or Nebuchadnezzar, built that kingdom and passed it on, and Belshazzar was just having a party. He didn't care.
If a conquering army has made its way in to the city, there's probably some people that were helping that conquering army into the city that didn't want Belshazzar in charge anymore anyway.
Very likely. I mean,
So
they made it in the gates overnight, but they didn't get to those gates that day.
yeah,
An army that big marched. And if he cared, he would have had warning that, hey, there's a big enemy headed this way. We need to be preparing. This guy's just having a party. What's written on the wall? Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin.
He's been measured.
You have been
measured, and
measured, you've been counted, weighed, and came up short. And that last part has a meaning. I mean, it kind of gets over into the Persians too. Just the word, it has this close association with that. How is the message fulfilled? Like right then that night. This isn't going to be way down in the future.
cashes it in.
This is it. The fulfillment is going to start just as soon as I get through telling you what it's going to be. What motivates the other officials to want to eliminate Daniel?
His success.
Jealousy, his success. We've mentioned so many times that you can either lift yourself up by doing things that are right, or try to lift yourself up by pulling somebody else down on a scale. And they chose to just keep themselves afloat by pulling him down.
Do you think it ever occurred to any of those guys to say, Daniel's being successful, maybe we should ask him what he's doing to be so successful?
I kind of doubt it. I think they enjoyed doing what they were doing the way they did it. And we talk about Belshazzar and what he chose to ignore. I don't know how these guys could have ignored who Daniel was. Does nobody know these stories?
And then they attack his relationship with God, which people still do.
Yeah.
Still will do that.
It's kind of like the Pharisees seeing the miracles being done and still persisting in.
Now, that's a good comparison. The Jewish leaders who saw Jesus and saw everything that Jesus did, and still chose to oppose him because they were proud and they were arrogant and they were corrupt and everything else, and that they did exactly the same thing that these men did.
In John chapter 11, when he raises Lazarus from the dead, the discussion after that is not how did he do that, but how do we keep the people from knowing that he did that?
Yeah, if we knew somebody had raised someone from the dead, we'd probably want to figure out what we can do to follow them. And their line of thought was, how can we get rid of this guy? He's a threat to our authority.
Yeah.
So where do they find a way to accuse Daniel?
His prayers.
In his relationship with his God and his following God's laws. That's the only place they were going to find a way to accuse him, because they weren't going to find a way to accuse him of wrongdoing. How does Darius feel about the situation?
Oh, he's sick about it. He loves Daniel. He recognizes Daniel's worth.
Yeah. And there again, that just shows you his character compared to Belshazzar.
Yeah.
That
We have to be really discouraged with Darius. Because, when he thought about what they did, about what type of people that he wanted, the kind of people that he had in key positions in his kingdom, he had to be disappointed in what they did and everything to Daniel, and about out and try to get there.
Yeah, that would have been a big disappointment because he's the one that put them where they were, and he'd put his trust in them, and here they conspired against the one that he liked the most, and that had to be disappointing. Okay, Mike, you can let him go.
Okay.
So this week, people are going to continue with Job or start Joshua or whatever they want to do to get caught up, because Sunday it is Job.
That's right.
And we are very glad we didn't skip Job, because we don't want to skip anything. It's all good.
It is all good.
It is all good, and we don't want to skip anything good. So it's Job this week? No. Yes.
Yes,
Job. See,
Job Sunday.
I'm working on Judges.
Me too.
But, so, anyway, see you Sunday, Lord willing. If it doesn't snow and get too terribly cold.